Hi guys, Bomber here, welcome back to the channel. And here are the best tips in order of complexity to become a master. It is okay if you don't get some of the last tips as a complete beginner. Get more experienced and then come back when you will have enough game experience and knowledge to actually comprehend everything. And with that said, let's jump into the tips. Tip number 1. Have a general knowledge of all the cards in the game. This is fundamental. Not doing this would be like playing poker without knowing which cards are in the deck, therefore what your opponent could have in their hand. Of course, the analogy is not 100% accurate, as poker has a shared deck, and the cards are always the same, and are not susceptible to the player deck building, etc. But I think it still gets the idea. Not knowing what cards are even there lets you not strategize at all, and you will basically be making your choices giving only the current board situation, not taking in consideration your opponent's possible hand, which is more than half the information you are ignoring. Considering this is a two-player game and not a single-player one. And I'm saying more than half, as punishes from your opponent can be game ending. To make another analogy, let's say you are a boxer. Considering only yourself, probably the best option would be to go for a full body weight all-in punch. This will be your best attack, with which you can deal the most damage, so it has to be the right choice, right? Probably if you're up against a punching bag, but if you're up against a real opponent, he could easily dodge that attack, and the all-in swing you gave would make you really vulnerable to a counter-attack. With this again, it is pretty clear that you have to consider what your opponent's counter plays even are, and to do this, you have to first know which cards are even there to expect. The most important ones are spells. The faster speed it is, the more important it gets, as a faster one are the ones which punishes you the most, with a particular care for removal spells. Then all bombs units, which are units with the greatest value, as most of the games those can swing the game in one direction or the other, and you should play around them like spells. Then of course all the other cards, with a priority towards cards more unpopular in the meta. Tip number 2. Know the meta. When you know all the possible cards that could come at you, you should know the actual environment you are playing in, as playing around more cards than you should could be counterproductive. For example, the first tip is comparable to knowing all the types of fish there are. But without knowing the environment, you could make the decision of not getting into the sea with the worry of encountering sharks, which are not even present in your territory, and you will miss an enjoyable experience. So what is the meta in the first place? Meta refers to the most efficient tactics available, or others argue that it is just whatever is outside of the game, like it is used in words such as metaphysics. Ignoring which meaning is actually correct, it is actually having knowledge of how the competitive environment looks like, so that when you are actually in the game, you know what to expect even before the game starts. Like if you see on the game start that you are up against an Aurelion Sol Leona deck, you should know that you are up against a control deck, a slow, value-oriented style of strategy. While if you are up against a Shen Lulu deck, you should know that you are up against an aggro deck, a fast, aggressive strategy. With this knowledge, you will mulligan and play your cards during the game in a better way, both considering the short-term value analysis, which you can achieve with the tip 1 already, and the long-term value analysis as well. For example, against a burn deck, usually new players are always greedy and end up doing value trades at the cost of Nexus health, then getting into their burn range and end up losing because of that. While in that matchup, your Nexus health should be one of your first priority. Or against a control deck, they overcommit into developing their board, only to then give their opponent more value with their board wipe. On a side note, it is worth knowing your deck plan even before you know your opponent one, which is kinda obvious but still worth saying. Tip number 3. Predictions, baits and punishments. First of all, let's talk about predictions, as the other two are a consequence of those. Let's say you are playing against an Ezreal deck, while you are an aggressive Feats Twisted Fate deck. To predict your opponent's play, you should enter your opponent's mind, and think like you would if your situations were swapped. Assuming you are both logical entities and the skill level is the same, you should come to the same conclusions. So, starting from the mulligan, you know that your opponent would highly want to keep a Mystic Shot, as he can get a lot of value from killing your Twisted Fate, as he knows that you want to play him as it is probably one of your key cards and for sure a very good card in general. So by this reasoning, you should assume and predict that your opponent has a Mystic Shot in hand from the start. Of course, there will be a hand where if your opponent wants that card, he will simply not draw it, and this is the key mechanic of games of chance, and card games in particular. But still, let's say that since he wants to have that card, he will keep that more often than not, therefore increasing the chances of him having that card, and you should always play around the most probable outcome. with that said, you successfully predicted he has a mystic shot in hand. How do you gain value out of that information? With baits or punishments? Let's talk about baits first. A bait is a play which makes your opponent really want to play a specific card, thinking he will get the best deal out of the trade, while you actually want him to play that same card as you have a stronger counterplay afterwards, which your opponent could not have considered. Returning to the Mystic Shot example, you predicted that he has it in hand, while you also have a Twisted Fate in hand, which you know that it is the card at which your opponent wants to throw the Mystic Shot at. So what do? You bait him into playing the Mystic Shot on something else, for example by playing other 2 health units before on turn 4, making him think that you don't have a Twisted Fate in hand, or by making a play which is punishable by Mystic Shot, making your opponent go for the punish, only to later on discover it was just a bait. For example, playing a spell which benefits from powder kegs, which your opponent can punish by killing the powder keg with Mystic Shot. So that after you baited your opponent into playing the Mystic Shot, you can safely play the Twisted Fate to which your opponent should have kept the Mystic Shot for. Obviously, this is not certain, as he could have another copy of Mystic Shot in hand, but again, I'm always considering the most probable situation in every one of my examples. Then there are punishes, which I already introduced in the previous example. Punishes are counter plays which usually comes after a bait. So for example, let's say you have a Fizz in play, and you have another 1 health unit in play, while you are at 0 mana. This situation is a natural bait for an incoming Static Shock, which you can punish with a 0 mana Warning Shot in hand, activating the Fizz ability and denying a 4 mana spell with a 0 mana 1, which gives you a lot more value than your opponent, therefore punishing his play. Punishes are most of the times very RNG driven, but there are ways to force them. Like in the previous example, you could have taken a bad block on purpose to reduce the health of the other unit to 1, to let your opponent think that he could punish you with Static Shock, while you actually wanted him to do that. Again, punishes comes often after a bait. This gets more into the mind game aspect of card games, which again, it is kind of related to poker, or any games with hidden information, unlike a deterministic game like chess, etc. Tip number 4. End reads. This is the most advanced and complicated tip. It requires all previous tips and builds on top of those. We are taking again the last example as a starting point. Let's say that you play a Twisted Fate. It is in your opponent's interest trying to remove it with a Mystic Shot, as we said. If he doesn't, then you can predict that he does not have it in hand. And you can build that knowledge on later turns as well, by keeping track of which card you drew and played. If after some turns he still has only cards from when you made that read, because he played all the cards he drew into after their turn, then you can assume that he still doesn't have that in hand, making your plays more clear and accurate, as you basically know what is in your opponent's hand. This is like knowing the meta, but instead of knowing what could come, you are removing options from the ones possible, narrowing even more the plays from your opponent that you have to worry about. This gets more and more complicated as you can make multiple hand reads during the game, and you should keep track of which card is and what, etc. Like for example, let's say that when he had 4 cards, you made a read that he didn't have a Mystic Shot. Well, when later on he has 6, you make another read that he does not have a Static Shock, so that now the 5th and 6th card are not Static Shock, while the rest aren't both Static Shock and Mystic Shot. This obviously gets out of hand with more and more reads, and with cards being played so that the order of cards gets changed. It is worth noting that if you play a spell but then do not confirm that, and it returns to the hand, it actually changes order and goes into the right. You should keep track of that also. This is so advanced that even I or other top tier players will probably not do this flawlessly during a game. At least not without pen and paper, as it gets pretty difficult to remember all those informations while also playing, and evaluating baits, punishes and all we have discussed before. But nonetheless, these are the tools that can make you ascend from an average player to a master. So, that's it for this video, hope you liked it and find it useful, and as always, see ya!